You mentioned the functional leads there, and you've tweeted before about kind of the difference between an org with kind of functional leadership versus an org with kind of GM leadership. Can I ask, for those that don't know, what's the difference between functional leadership or functional org versus GM org? What's the difference there first?
Yeah, so a functional org is roughly what I described, right? So if you look at the CEO and their exec team, each leader on that team is going to have a function. So you have a head of engineering, you have a head of design, you have a head of product, you have a head of operations, a head of finance. Like it's very functional. It's sort of like the most simplistic, straightforward org design. It's where most companies are going to start. A GM focused org is where most big companies end up, right? So a GM focused org is where you've got single threaded leaders that in theory own a P&L. And under that leader, they have a head of finance, a head of ops, a head of product, a head of tech. And so you end up having like hundreds of these GMs that manage a single P&L and have sort of pockets of each of these functions inside of their business. And maybe somewhat controversially, I think the second you go to a GM-focused org, you're not a startup anymore. Like you are a big company. And almost all of the downsides of a big company that people bemoan, the amount of HR, the amount of overhead and decision-making, like all the over-processedness, I think is all a byproduct of that single decision. And I think you could not have built a company like Amazon or another large company without doing that, but it has all sorts of negative repercussions. And I think if you're a startup, like you're so far on the other side of that extreme that I think it's like more of a unnecessarily intellectual exercise to think about going to GM than it is actually going to do any good for you. And you can build huge companies that are functional. Apple is like a functional org.
Yeah, that's my question. Like I've interviewed, functional leaders from Snap and LinkedIn in the last 2 days. These are big companies and public companies. Yeah, I would still say they very much run functional orgs. How should founders determine whether they should run a functional versus a GM-led org? What's right for me?
Yeah, I mean, I'm far on this extreme, but I think stick with functional until it's like so obvious that it just can't possibly work that maybe there's an excuse to go to a GM-focused org. And certainly if you've got like a manageable number of product lines, I wouldn't even like have the conversation. Like it's just not worth the debate. It is going to make your business worse. And it might not do it right away, but it is definitely going to do it on the long term.
I totally agree. GM-led is just, it feels very formalized and too structured to me, I have to admit. I'm like a rebel against
it's honestly not even it's not the formalized. It's like, if you think about like all the things all the extra process that creates, right? So like, if you have a GM-focused org, like you now have to do all this work to make sure that like all of your Eng2s are leveled at the same level because one's in this team and one's in that team and then don't talk at all and they have no idea what the other team's doing. And so if they transfer from this team to that team, you have to make sure that they're both as competent and you have to make sure that everyone's compensation is identical across 15 different businesses for the same level. It is what creates like an enormous amount of HR work, an enormous amount of like overhead, because you're trying to do all these weird backflips to make sure that there's consistency in the business instead of just having a whole org of engineers and a whole org of designers where that stuff just comes in kind.
I also feel like you're creating this kind of dysfunctional decision making because you have kind of CEOs on top of CEOs. Like, your GM who runs that segment isn't actually the ultimate decision maker. They can still get overridden by, the CEO up top or the CPO who's ahead of them, who's just and so you create this very strange chasm between power ultimately.
Yep. And you just don't have your best people on every product, right? Like if you've got your head of product and your head of engine, your head of design working on every product, they're going to be better. Just like de facto going to be better product.